If there's one piece of lore even those most casually acquainted with the series know about A Song of Ice and Fire, it's the Targaryens and their dragons. Red dragons, black dragons, mother's dragons, the young dragon, the last dragon, the house of the dragon, etc., etc. The Targaryens are key to the themes George R. R. Martin is trying to explore using A Song of Ice and Fire. What makes a king a king? What is the difference between a king and an ordinary person? What makes them legitimate? Who the Targaryens were and are, who they claim to be, and who they aren't, are all used to explore these ideas of royal families, power and legitimacy, and the narratives that create them. We see the shadow they cast across Westeros, and how even after the dragons are extinct and the dynasty overthrown, it's never really gone away. This family and the dynasty they constitute are also a central part of George R. R. Martin's world-building for Westeros. The prequel history book is all about the different Targaryen kings. The years that are used as the dating system start from the Targaryen Conquest, etc., etc. So much of the world-building orbits around them. So we can look at them to see how George R. R. Martin is so successful in his world-building for Westeros. Fantasy world builders have a unique problem. They can draw on history for inspiration, but the reader also brings along their own pool of history knowledge, historical references, sometimes even misconceptions. To world build realism, they have to create something that feels realistic, authentic, that matches these ideas the reader has, while also definitionally including impossible phenomena. What gives George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire world and its imagined history the sense of realism that so many readers, myself included, are drawn to, that get it described as gritty, realistic, down-to-earth fantasy, an exception in the genre? Note that we say a sense of realism rather than simply realism. Yes, I have no doubt that any dedicated medieval scholar could find 100 things not exactly like the medieval Europe of our own world in Westeros, but it is fiction, and more importantly, it is fantasy fiction. It's an imagined secondary world, and a secondary world that's as fantastical as any other example in the genre. In that sense, it's never going to be realistic. What we need to ask is how that feeling or sense of realism is maintained even when objectively unreal or impossible things are taking place on the page. That is, how the fantastical elements are believably integrated with the elements we recognize as being parallel to those of our own world. And so not only are the Targaryens thematically important, they also provide us an ideal answer to examine this question because they represent a blending between real historical ideas that the readers are familiar with from our own world, kings, dynasties, thrones, with fantasy elements that are impossible but also need to be believed by the reader. So what can we say about the Targaryens as a dynasty? What is their dynastic identity they all have in common? Of course, there's the dragons, both literally and as a brand identity. There's the silver gold hair, the purple eyes. And we also have abilities beyond those of normal people: heat resistance, immunity to illness, the ability to connect in some possibly psychic way to those dragons. Beyond that, though, these are crucially larger-than-life figures. They have a certain ambivalence to them between charisma and madness. We have this popular phrase, when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin. And in some way we get the sense this is rooted in the fact that they're outsiders to Westeros, they're foreigners of some variety. They're called the blood of Valyria, or the blood of the dragon. They come from this doomed civilization that is Valyria. And apart from the dragons, probably what is most known about them is the practice of incest, right? We see multiple examples throughout the historical lore of them marrying brother to sister. The first and most obvious point of comparison to the Targaryens should of course be the Normans. Aegon the Conqueror almost explicitly calls out William the Conqueror, who took the throne of England in 1066 after a succession crisis caused by the death of Edward the Confessor. And in this way, the Targaryens can be seen as a historical parallel to the Normans in the history of England in our own world. That use of the dragon draws a lot of similarities between the Targaryens and the Normans because, of course, the Normans originally were Norsemen. They settled in the Normandy region of France, but they were originally Scandinavians. Famously, on the Bayeux Tapestry, they have these ships that have the classical kind of Viking head, the dragon head. So we can see this idea of dragon ships coming over and conquering England as somewhat parallel or a precursor to the idea of the Targaryen dragons coming and conquering Westeros. The actual military details of the Norman conquest are not that relevant. It's a fantasy novel. We shouldn't expect a one-to-one parallel, but the central theme of narratives of legitimacy is right there in the question. How do you go from the might makes right logic of taking England by the sword to becoming the legitimate king, the legitimate ruler just by blood or by inheritance, by some kind of right? In this way, we can see that Martin is inspired not only by the physical conquest, but also its rituals and symbolic gestures. Aegon's anointing as king at Old Town and the construction of the fortress that will go on to become the Red Keep are evocative of William's coronation and election as king by the Witan at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day in 1066, and his construction of the Tower of London in its first form. Specifically, Martin takes the idea of the start date of William's reign only coming from this coronation and uses it for Aegon's reign, which we specifically are told is counted from his anointing in the Starry Set in Old Town. And this is the date that all of Westeros still counts from for their dating system. So the year zero, the stunned null for Westeros, isn't when Aegon landed or any of the big battles when Aegon physically became in charge of Westeros, but the ritual. What's important is that Aegon's conquest gets its legitimating narrative. Looking more broadly, we see that this idea of a dynasty of outsiders ruling over disparate groups is not all that uncommon in the Middle Ages. In some ways, this is considered to be a time before the kind of classical narratives of nationalism were developed, and so you had multiple different groups or different areas being ruled over by a single dynasty. And so where you had multiple different groups, tribes, cities, areas being ruled over by a single dynasty, there needed to be something that crossed the boundaries between them. We can see this in the Lombards in Italy, and then later the Normans again in Italy, Sicily, and North Africa. And also in the east, in the Kievan Rus, that's the medieval predecessor state claimed by both modern-day Ukraine and Russia, where we have the Rurikids. The Rurikids are a dynasty descended from a legendary founder, Rurik, who is central to this legend of the calling of the Varangians in 862 AD. In which three Scandinavian brothers, Varangians, that is, Vikings or Scandinavians, are called in to rule over the tribes of Rus, to give them order. The foremost of these being this King Rurik, who would go on to spawn a dynasty that would rule over a lot of different states, including Muscovy and eventually the Russian Empire. This topic is, of course, still fraught with a lot of unknowns and is still highly controversial. Rurik might not even be a real historical person. For us, it will suffice to talk about the legend. Right, so we have the idea that the Varangians have a universal right above or across tribal boundaries. This is what gave them the order between the different feuding Slavic tribes. And it also connected them to the imperial might, that is to say, the imperial Roman might of Byzantium. Right, you have the Varangian connection between Scandinavia through modern-day Russia and Ukraine across the Black Sea to Byzantium, where famously you had the Varangian guards that functioned as the private bodyguard of the emperor. And so again, we see this idea similar to the Targaryens of outsiders coming in to rule over feuding kingdoms, adopting the local religion and customs. And again, the year 862, the year of the calling of the Varangians in the Russian Primary Chronicle, is still to this day used as one of the origin points for at least Russian statehood, much like 1066 in England. For example, we can see in 1862, the Russian Empire celebrated a millennium of Russia. Performing as foreigners or outsiders might seem strange to us in more democratic times. In modern societies, rulers tend to emphasize how they are just like us, just like the people they are purporting to represent. In pre-modern monarchy, we see the opposite. We see an emphasis of the gap between the ruler and the ruled, the idea that the royal bloodline is something objectively, qualitatively different from the common people. And so this is where we get this idea of the race of the old Varyags, as they're sometimes called, as being the sole legitimate rulers. When the Rurikids were finally dethroned in Russia in 1598 by the accession of Boris Godunov, he still had to contend with the historical myth of the Varyags in the form of the numerous Rurikid pretenders that appear to challenge his right to rule. Pushkin has this line in his play of the same name: "The boyars remember Godunov as erst he was, peer to themselves." So that we can see that he doesn't have this myth of a separateness, a myth of a gap between him and the other boyars, those are the nobles. And that makes him less irreplaceable, that makes him less remote. That allows the boyars to ask, why is he ruling instead of me if we're not so different? And that's where this idea of an outsider bloodline or an outsider family comes in. That's where this has power. And we see this idea of a special bloodline, a special descent, emphasized as a central idea of the Targaryens in Song of Ice and Fire, right? They're the blood of old Valyria, specifically the Valyrian freehold that was doomed about 400 years before the events of A Song of Ice and Fire in some kind of cataclysm. And this is not at all uncommon in medieval Europe, right? We have this idea of descent from refugees from Troy, right? For example, the British kings in Geoffrey of Monmouth's pseudo-history, the Capetians. The Habsburgs famously fabricated a genealogy connecting them all the way back to biblical Noah, as well as through Julius Caesar to Aeneas, probably the most famous refugee of doomed Troy and one of the mythical founders of the Roman state. This was as they came into their power as one of the most important families of Europe and oftentimes Holy Roman emperors. It became necessary for them to fabricate a more illustrious, more imperial origin than an obscure fortress in the Swiss Aargau. This idea is built upon in the fantasy of A Song of Ice and Fire. There's this idea that the Targaryens are not only Valyrians, they're not only outsiders to Westeros, but they're perhaps not even, in some ways, fully human, right? They're often called the blood of the dragon. And this is kind of hinted at in those murals in the House of the Dragon TV show, or the human monster hybrid babies they occasionally give birth to. They have some kind of inhuman or not fully human quality. Perhaps they have some literal blood of the dragon in their descent. And we see the same idea in medieval history, another element giving kings and royals their larger-than-life mythological charisma that legitimizes their power. For example, we can look at Merovech, the semi-mythical king who gives his name to the Frankish Merovingian dynasty, who is said to be the son of a human woman and a type of sea serpent or sea monster called a quinatar. That's a half-bull, half-sea serpent. So he wasn't entirely human. Again, a number of different European dynasties were claimed to be descendants of Melusine, a mythological character that was sometimes a water spirit, sometimes half woman, half serpent, sometimes the daughter of the devil, or the devil himself in female form. The Lusignans, the Luxembourg Limburgs of the early Roman Empire, and particularly the Angevins, who we know in their role as the dynasty of English kings called the Plantagenets, all had this claimed heritage as something partially diabolical, something semi-demonic. So the Plantagenets were a dynasty of English kings that succeeded to the Normans. Henry II inherited the throne from rival claimant Stephen of Blois in 1154, after he was named Stephen's heir in a peace treaty to conclude the anarchy, the civil war which had broken out when the main line of Norman succession was thrown into crisis by the death of Henry I's heir, William Adelin, in the White Ship disaster of 1120. Henry was the child of Matilda, the daughter of Henry I, named his heir and later Empress of the Romans, and Geoffrey of Anjou, also called Geoffrey Plantagenet. This is the Count Geoffrey of Anjou that was legendarily descended from Melusine, making him and all the kings of the Plantagenet dynasty at least partially inhuman. And this semi-diabolical nature was apparent right through the Plantagenet dynasty. Their collective identity was as larger-than-life figures, more energetic, more strong-willed, more hot-tempered than ordinary men, with huge statures and fiery red hair to match. We can see in the very first Plantagenet, Henry II, this famous rage that bordered on madness. He had such a violent temper that he would tear his clothes or get down on the floor to chew and gnaw on the rushes. And this resulted in his most famous incident, the killing of Thomas Becket, which he perhaps indirectly ordered in a fit of rage. But this reputation could be both sinister and charismatic. Henry was also energetic, not towering like an ordinary man. He was a human chariot dragging all after him. And this reputation persisted through all the Plantagenets that followed. The red hair, the dynastic symbol, was a strong visual link, even if there was no doubt really a great number of people in the kingdom with red hair. It provided a visual identity of continuity. The red-haired, strong-willed Richard the Lionheart was apparently fond of telling his story of descent from Melusine, presenting her as the daughter of the devil, so promoting his own semi-diabolical heritage, perhaps to bolster his reputation of martial or sexual prowess. King John feared not God nor respected men, and he has a sinister reputation that comes down to us this day in the myths of Robin Hood. And in Westeros, we kind of see these same kind of ideas, this idea that kings are built differently to other men, the Targaryen powers of heat resistance, immunity to disease. These are extensions of the larger-than-life aura of the Plantagenets, their stature, their energy. And this kind of comes through as something ambivalent, right? We have this idea that when the Targaryens are born, the gods flip a coin. this larger-than-life quality can appear as either heroic or diabolical. As we see in the Plantagenets, you have both beloved kings like Richard the Lionheart and rather sinister figures like Henry II or John. But they all share this same family temperament, just like we have the Targaryens, Mad King Aerys, but also the kind of romanticized Prince Rhaegar. Finally, we must consider that most outrageous feature of the Targaryens, the practice of incest. And to find inspiration for this, we must look to the ancient world, to Egypt's Ptolemies. Ptolemy Soter was a general and bodyguard of Alexander the Great, who, after the death of Alexander in Babylon, turned his satrapy of Egypt into his own personal kingdom, while the empire disintegrated into the warring factions of the diadarchy, Alexander's successors. He established a dynasty that would rule Egypt as pharaohs for 275 years, considered the last dynasty of Egypt, before the kingdom fell into the hands of the Romans with the death of Cleopatra VII. That's the famous Cleopatra we all know from the story of Antony and Cleopatra, etc., etc. Now, attitudes to incest have varied throughout different regions and historical periods, but very few dynasties have practiced it to the degree of closeness and with the commitment of the Ptolemies, regularly engaging in incest of the closest degree, marrying brother and sister for hundreds of years. They began this practice of incest almost immediately in the first generation after Ptolemy I. Ptolemy's son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, was married to his sister, Arsinoe II, and they also engaged in polygynous marriage. One Ptolemaic ruler, Ptolemy VIII, was married simultaneously to his sister and his niece, the daughter of his first sister wife, and her former husband, who was also their brother. And we can see in the way that the Ptolemies push the bounds of what is even possible in the family tree, exactly the model that's used in the Targaryen practice of incest. Right? These were a Hellenic Macedonian dynasty ruling over Egypt as outsiders, and this practice emphasizes the divide between the ruler and the rules. It wasn't until the famous Cleopatra VII, after nearly 3 centuries, that a member of the dynasty even bothered learning the Egyptian language. And this wasn't something that was normal in Egypt. The Ptolemies crossed numerous boundaries of cultural and moral norms. It implied a lack of restraint, a lack of self-control. And again, deliberately violating moral norms may seem odd to us coming from a time with a more democratic inclination, but it only further emphasizes this separation between the ruler and the ruled, a physical separation, but also a moral one. A moral or sacred taboo restricts the behavior for the general population, but by allowing it for a few, it makes them in some way sacred or powerful. We can see that in this wonderful quote. And yet the breaking of barriers, the flouting of civilized structures, the invitation to open a door into the world of chaos may be beneficial, provided that it is done by the right individual, the extraordinary one, the divine one, the magical one, the royal one. We see this in A Song of Ice and Fire. Their practice of incest is literally called the doctrine of exceptionalism. And so this is their way of separating themselves out from the general population of Westeros, morally as well as physically. And this is an idea succinctly expressed in a quote from Daenerys' very first chapter. Viserys had told her 1,000 times, theirs was the king's blood, the golden blood of old Valyria, the blood of the dragon. Dragons did not mate with the beasts of the field, and Targaryens did not mingle their blood with that of lesser men. And this is the very thing that the dragons in A Song of Ice and Fire also represent, right? They are a power that is too dangerous for the average person, supposedly too dangerous for the average person to wield. You can say that with the Targaryens, it isn't some special nature, some innate separateness from the general population that allows them to do these things, but rather the things that they do that creates the appearance of being separate, of being above and apart from society. With these things in mind, we can now come to some interesting conclusions about the Targaryens in A Song of Ice and Fire. Were they really a noble family in Old Valyria who sought refuge on Dragonstone after foreseeing the doom? There's good reason to be skeptical of that idea, like the idea of European royals being descended from refugees from Troy, or the Rokids coming from a legendary fan of Rurik. This may just be another of those legends that we've discussed all throughout this video. Maybe they have some Valyrian ancestry, it certainly appears so. Perhaps they're partially descended from some kind of Valyrian presence on Dragonstone, or perhaps from across the Narrow Sea, but they're hardly the only people who look like Valyrians in that part of the world. The only certain refugees from Valyria are the dragons fleeing doomed Valyria to come and settle on Dragonstone's volcano, and everything that they represent, the power, the might, the legitimacy of Imperial Valyria. This is something that, one way or the other, the Targaryens want to depict themselves as connected to through their connection with the dragons. And so we can say that it's entirely possible the story of Daenerys the Dreamer and the flight from Doom Valyria was fabricated later to create this narrative of Targaryen exceptionalism. If true, this goes a long way to explain that time gap between the Doom of Valyria and the Targaryens coming and taking over Westeros. We're told there's about a century between those two events. And now we can get the idea that this wasn't a case of the Targaryens arriving on Dragonstone fully formed as dragon-riding nobles and then sitting around for 100 years before one day deciding to take over Westeros. But rather, this 100 years was when the Targaryens were being formed, their identity was being created, the mythology was being created, and at the same time, perhaps taming the dragons, becoming dragon riders, putting dragons on their banners, linking themselves symbolically to Valyria. This is the exact process we looked at over and over again when looking at their historical inspirations. This is all only my speculation, however, we probably will never actually get a concrete answer on that, but whatever the case, I think there's a good reason to be skeptical. We can see that this is key to the themes that the Targaryens and their dynastic identity are being used to explore the narratives of legitimacy, the mythology, and the charisma of a special royal bloodline that justifies their power. We can now return to that list of Targaryen features and see that for some of them, like the incest, the foreignness of the dynasty, Martin is taking inspiration for real-world dynasties, while others, like the silver hair, the blood of old Valyria, etc., are fantastical creations, but in every case they're expressing the same ideas. So finally here we can see how George R. R. Martin's use of history in his world building is so effective. When he's looking to history for inspiration, it isn't just a case of pastiching a particular historical period and adding random fantasy elements on top, nor is it jamming together a patchwork of different historical influences purely to create something suitably fantastical and novel. Rather, he is going first to the themes of the story. These are the key ideas of A Song of Ice and Fire: identity, family identity, the narratives of power, and how they relate to political legitimacy, and how a family identity turns into a royal bloodline, a dynasty, and then looking to the different examples of history for how that turns out. Again, when George R. R. Martin goes beyond history to add his own original fantasy elements, the purple eyes, the hair, the blood of the dragon, we see that they are continuing in the same direction suggested by our real historical examples. It's this congruency of direction between the historical models chosen for inspiration and the totally fantastical elements that creates Westeros' sense of realism. The fantasy and the historical elements both fit together because they are working towards the same theme. That concludes my thoughts on the historical inspirations for the Targaryen dynasty in A Song of Ice and Fire. What are some historical parallels that you've noticed in A Song of Ice and Fire? What are your thoughts? Leave them down in the comment section.